Hi, everybody, and welcome back to another installment of the EBI seminar series on science communication. This episode will be the second part to an episode we released a couple weeks ago, where we were joined by Dr. Shreeharsh Kelkar. Shreeharsh joined us to talk about the history of AI and its implications leading up to this point. But today we're going to be talking about the implications of AI in a modern context and the consequences it's had on journalism and science. If you haven't already, we encourage you to go watch the first part of this episode. And we thank you for watching this one, and we hope you watch until the end. Thank you.
But the ideas of expert systems in some sense have percolated everywhere, even though, we don't really have expert systems. Like the hype was too much, but then lots of gains were made, but nothing happened that equaled the hype. And I suspect something similar will happen today as well.
That's a super interesting history. Thank you for sharing. So, moving our trajectory a little bit, do you think that AI is an obstacle for science, a tool for science, or do you think it's somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think the important thing here is to sort of ask, well, what does it mean to do AI in science? And because AI is, it's is it like, are we going to use computer vision in science? Are you going to use NLP? But really, when people say AI in science, what they mean is big data analysis, right? So it's about using different kinds of machine learning algorithms to analyze scientific data, right? And once you think of it that way, this change in science has been happening for about the last 20 years. Increasingly, right, scientists are doing sort of like cyclotrons and all these reactors and sort of gene sequences. All of these have become data that scientists are analyzing. So a lot of what scientific work has become, or at least in certain areas of, say, physics or biology, is big data analysis of a certain sort, right? And sort of once sort of the way of doing science changes, right, that always leads to different questions for scientists. So for instance, if doing science means you're actually doing big data analysis, that means that programs to train scientists will have to change, right? They will have to be taught programming, they will have to be taught big data analysis. It also raises questions of like how credit will be assigned. So, if I'm building a program to analyze like cyclotron data, am I just a programmer or am I a physicist? And these kinds of struggles are sort of playing out in science over and over again. So there are sort of all these debates going on in science about like how should we train scientists? How should we give credit for science, right? There are also other questions, for instance, of like verification and standards. So if a lot of science is going to involve big data analysis, how do we know that the science is correct? Will we share the data? Will we share the code? If we share the data, how exactly should it be shared? Because these are not simple questions to answer, right? So what's happening in a lot of different scientific fields is sort of a debate among scientists, which is that, given that we are going to be using big data, which is, I guess, what, you could call AI, given that we're going to be using all these sophisticated algorithms to analyze big data, how should we think about what it means to be a scientist?
Yeah, absolutely. So you're talking a lot about credit and you're talking about the role that AI will have in this certain field of science. So expanding a little bit on that, what do you think the effects of AI will be in journalism as opposed to science?
The consequences for journalism, I think, are going to be a little more sort of more dire, or at least, well, at least it seems that way. But I think for that, we have to kind of go back to sort of the business model for journalism. Like what's going to happen is not just about AI, but it's sort of what has been happening to journalism over decades. And again, a bit of history is always good, right? So back in the 1950s and 60s, we have newspapers and magazines, and essentially we have local monopolies, right? So there's one newspaper for LA, right? The LA Times, or there's usually two or more for a given city, right? There's one for Washington, D.C., there's one for Baltimore, there's one for New York. And essentially what newspapers do is they bundle all sorts of things, right? So you have the city section of the newspaper, you have the international section of the newspaper, you have the comics, you have the crossword puzzles, you have the sports section. And all these sections are subsidizing each other, right? So most people might only read the sports section, right? But the sports section is subsidizing all the reporting that very few people will read, but it's the kind of reporting that you get the Pulitzer for, right? So high status reporting, right? And this kind of system actually was pretty good. And all of this was powered by classifieds and advertisements. So because you had local monopolies, like if you want to sell something in Baltimore, you will advertise in the Baltimore Sun or put a classifieds ad there. So for about, a good 50 years or so, this model actually worked well. It produced good journalism, and journalism that was, you could say good for democracy, but also good for entertainment. And it also, I think, gave journalists good careers. Like you could be a journalist and make a good living, right? And then what has happened is that the internet has sort of kind of changed all of that. So one thing that happens with the internet is, you no longer need to put classifieds in a newspaper. You kind of all you need to do is put it on Craigslist. And so newspapers in some sense lost their revenue. You no longer need to read your newspaper for international news. You could go and read like international newspapers, right? So if you want to know about what's happening in India, you could go read Indian newspapers rather than reading the international section of your newspaper, right? So what was bundled together in a newspaper has sort of started to become unbundled. And so most journalism today is really kind of trying to figure out a business model. But what this has resulted is that we have a lot more content today. So you can't necessarily say that we don't have content. There's a lot more journalism, right? Certain kinds of journalism have stopped, like local journalism, because there's no audience for them. But you could argue there's lots of journalism we get that's actually better, like music criticism, television criticism, international news. All of that has become better. But this has been disastrous also for journalists. It is really hard to make a good living if you are a journalist. Because on the one hand, there's lots of content that is being produced, but then nobody's really getting paid for it. So a lot of content that gets produced today is like low level content, right? And the idea is, let's say today there's a big event, right? And you know that everybody will want to know about this event. I don't know, some controversy about, give me an example.
Taylor Swift.
All right, fine. Okay, Taylor Swift. Some controversy about Taylor Swift happens. What most people do today, they'll go and type Taylor Swift on Google, and they will read the first two articles that come up there, right? So what all these media outlets now do is they pay like freelancers or low-level people who don't get paid that much. Say, okay, you need to produce, 300, 500 words about Taylor Swift about what happened today, right? And you need to do it such that it will actually come at the top on Google, right? That has become sort of the default model for journalism today, partly because like the old sustainable model kind of dropped away, the ground kind of fell away, right? And once you think about that, then you can see why chat gpt might not be such a good thing, right? So if like the way most journalists work now, so there are still good journalists, some get very well paid, but in order to have like a big journalistic ecosystem, you need a business model. And now, think of chat gpt. So if today's news is about Taylor Swift, why can't I just ask chat gpt to say, write me 500 words about Taylor Swift, and then maybe I can make some edits to it, and then I post it. And arguably, that's going to be even quicker than asking a freelancer to write 500 words, right? And essentially, what this is going to do, well, I mean, hopefully, this is not what will happen, is that it essentially means that more and more content gets produced, but the quality of that content is going to keep dropping. It's not that ChatGPT can't write good stuff about Taylor Swift, right? But ChatGPT is just going to write stuff about, it's not going to write truly interesting things about Taylor Swift. It's not going to go do deep reporting on Taylor Swift, right? It's basically going to combine some things it's being trained on and produce quite competent 5, 10 paragraphs, right? And so partly, and I don't know how this is going to end because we still don't have sort of a good business model for journalism. But I think Chat GPT is not going to, improve what is going on. But this doesn't start with ChatGPT. It kind of starts with the internet and the collapse of the business model.
Absolutely. So, as we're talking a little bit about improvements in communication and truth and such, some of your research touches on the role of truth and objectivity in both politics and science. So, what do you take objectivity to be in science, and how is this being threatened?
So I think, like I said, the AI in science or big data in science is going to lead to scientists have to figure out lots of things, right? Like I said, questions of training and credit. And objectivity in science is really about what are the standards of evidence in science, right? That's one way to define it. And standards of evidence change with time. And so it depends on the invention of new instruments, it depends on the invention of new practices. And if big data analysis is another sort of thing, right? It's a new set of practices in science. It's going to mean that scientists are going to have to debate what counts as good evidence. And this is kind of what we talked about in the previous question, right? Like if you're going to if a lot of science is going to be based on big data analysis, do you share data? How do you share data? Do you share code? What does it mean to share code? What does reproducible code mean? What does reproducible data mean? Right? And so there is going to be a discussion about standards of objectivity in science. And that is sort of already happening. But I think that is mostly internal to scientists, right? Like scientists have been doing this for 200 years as new techniques arise. They have figured out how to think about standards of evidence. But I think the real threat to objectivity in science is not coming from these practices, which essentially is an internal scientific matter to be figured out. But I think the real threat to objectivity in science is coming from public distrust. And that is very little to do with AI per se or big data per se. There's a great book called The Crisis of Expertise. It's by the sociologist Jill Leal. And one of the ways he sort of phrases it is that he says that over the last 50 years, we scientized politics, and so now we have ended up politicizing science, right? And so what does he mean? Over the last sort of 50 years, we have used science for regulation a lot, right? So anytime there's a big public question, should we build this nuclear power plant? Should we build this new road? These are contentious public questions. What has happened is that we've tried to get science to answer these questions. So, should we build this road? Do an environmental impact review. Should you build this factory? Figure out if X substance is a carcinogen or not, right? But of course, what happens is that if you take sort of debates, public debates about public projects in some sense, and turn them into scientific debates, you don't stop the debate, you just transfer it into a different domain, right? So rather than the public debate being contentious, the scientific debate becomes contentious, right? When you make a big decision hinge on the result of a scientific study, that contention just passes into the science. And so over the last 50 years, what we see is this sort of contentious debates in science, because the science is going to lead to sort of big public decisions. And of course, what happens is that essentially, right, now you have experts arguing tooth and nail over some topic, right? And when the public sees like two PhDs sort of going at it like about some particular question, right? X substance is a carcinogen or not, or something like that. What that leads to is that a distrust in expertise per se, right? Here there are two PhDs arguing, and they can't even agree on anything. So what does that tell me about what these PhDs do, right? And that is in some sense a bigger, and we see this kind of distrust everywhere, right? Like there's vaccine hesitancy, there's all kinds of things, right? Uh, and you could argue that the question internal to science is about standards of evidence, But the sort of bigger public question is, how do we think of science in our public life? What role should it play? And right now, that role that it should play is itself being negotiated, partly because we've put so much importance of science, like, that's what he means. He says, we scientized politics, and what that meant was that now we have politicized science. So that's why, in some sense, you see sort of much more distrust of science among certain kinds of people than you did before. So the problem for objectivity in science is not AI. That will be settled. The bigger problem is really sort of this question of what the public status of science should be. And we would like it to play a big role, but we may have ended up giving it such a big role that now it is itself a matter of intention.
Very interesting. And landing on that note of shifting from AI to our own issues among humans, I think that's a great note to end on. So that just about does it for all of our questions. Thank you so much for joining us. This was really insightful about the history and the implications of AI going forward, or just big data in general, or just science in general. So this was a really illuminating conversation. And thank you for joining us, myself and everyone at the EBI. Wish you the best of luck on all your future endeavors.
Okay, thank you for having me. I really enjoyed talking about this.
All right, perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for checking out the EBI seminar series on science communication. If you've enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe to our channel for more content on how science is communicated. Be sure to follow along for future installments or check out our previous series and explore social media, which are all linked in the description below. Thanks for watching and see you next time.